The runestone beneath Astrid's fingertips pulsed with warmth that defied the bitter cold, each carved line seeming to breathe with a life of its own. She pulled her hand back as if burned, the ancient Norse words continuing their relentless translation in her mind. Awakening vessel, the wolf time comes. Her archaeological training, dormant for a decade, surged back with unwelcome clarity. Fenris let out a low growl that rumbled through the frozen ground, his massive frame casting dancing shadows in the blue light. The sound was wrong, too deep, too knowing. Beside him, Skoll's lips pulled back to reveal teeth that seemed longer than they had that morning, gleaming like polished bone in the eerie illumination. "Easy," Astrid whispered in Old Norse, the language she'd spoken exclusively for years now, finding comfort in words her grandmother had taught her. "Easy, my children." But even as she spoke the endearment, ice formed in her chest. These weren't her children. They never had been. The storm that had raged for 3 days showed no signs of abating. It had been like no winter tempest she'd experienced in her decade of isolation. The wind didn't just howl, it seemed to sing in harmonies that made her teeth ache. The permafrost around her cabin had cracked and shifted, revealing not just these runestones, but an entire circle of them, arranged in a pattern that made her archaeologist's mind reel with implications. She'd found Fenris and Skoll as cubs in the ruins of her village, Ulsfjord, population 47, until the plague took them all in a single night. She'd been 24 then, home from university to document local folklore for her dissertation on pre-Christian burial practices. The irony wasn't lost on her now. The cubs had been the only other living things she'd found in the aftermath, huddled together beside their dead mother near the old stave church. She'd assumed wolves had fled the disease-ridden settlement, that these two had been orphaned by circumstance. 10 years of shared survival had bonded them into something she'd believed was family. Now, watching them circle the runestones with predatory grace, she wondered if they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Astrid retreated toward her cabin, a structure she'd built herself using traditional methods. No power lines, no roads, no connection to the modern world she'd abandoned. The logs groaned in the wind, but the walls held strong. Inside, seal oil lamps cast warm light across furs and hand-carved furniture. Dried herbs hung from the rafters alongside smoked fish and meat. It was a life carved from nothing, sustained by will and the skills her grandmother had insisted she learn despite her parents' protests. "Old ways for old souls," Grandmother Sigrid had said. "Someday you'll need them." The wolves followed her inside without invitation, as they had every night for 10 years. But tonight their presence filled the space differently, not companionship, but surveillance. They positioned themselves on either side of the door, yellow eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Astrid moved to her bookshelf, fingers trailing over volumes she'd salvaged from the university before, retreating to this self-imposed exile. Most were academic texts on Norse mythology and archaeological methods, but tucked among them were her grandmother's handwritten journals filled with stories the old woman had insisted were history, not legend. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its pages brittle with age, and flipped to entries about bloodlines and destinies, about families chosen by the gods for purposes mortals weren't meant to understand. Her grandmother's spidery handwriting seemed to writhe in the lamplight. The Eriksdottir line carries the wolf's blessing and the wolf's curse. When the stones sing and the sky bleeds light, the last daughter will hear the call. She will choose, embrace the ending, or fight the inevitable. But remember, little star, the gods play a longer game than mortal hearts can comprehend. Astrid's hands shook as she read words she'd dismissed as folklore when her grandmother was alive. Outside, the wind picked up, and through the small window she could see the runestones glowing brighter, their light painting the falling snow in shades of electric blue. Fenris rose from his position by the door, padding toward her with steps that seemed too measured, too purposeful. When he reached her side, he didn't seek the absent-minded scratches behind the ears she'd given him countless times before. Instead, he sat perfectly still and stared at her with eyes that held far too much intelligence. "What are you?" she whispered. His answering growl might have been laughter. The seal oil lamps flickered, as if something had passed between them and the flames. In that moment of dancing shadows, Astrid could have sworn she saw something else entirely, not wolves, but shapes that belonged to nightmares and ending times, creatures with too many teeth and eyes like dying stars. When the light steadied, they were just wolves again. But the damage was done. The careful life she'd built, the peace she'd carved from solitude and survival, lay in ruins as surely as her village had 10 years ago. Outside, the runestones sang their ancient song, and somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard answering calls echoing across the fjords. The ordinary world. Sleep didn't come that night. Astrid lay on her hand-built bed, wrapped in reindeer hides that had kept her warm through countless Arctic nights, listening to the wolves breathe in perfect synchronization. The sound had once been her lullaby, proof that she wasn't truly alone in this vast emptiness. Now it felt like a countdown. When pale dawn finally crept through the storm clouds, she rose and began her morning routine with deliberate precision, clinging to the rhythms that had sustained her sanity for 10 years. First, check the seal oil reserves. Second, inspect the meat stores in the cold cellar. Third, tend the fire that had burned continuously since she'd first struck flint to kindling in this place. Each task was a prayer to the ordinary, a desperate attempt to rebuild the walls of normalcy that had crumbled the moment she'd touched those runestones. Fenris and Skoll watched her from their positions by the hearth, yellow eyes tracking her movements. They'd always been observant. It was how they'd survived together, but this felt different, clinical, as if they were taking inventory. "Hungry?" she asked in Old Norse, the language flowing from her lips like a native tongue despite her university education. 10 years of speaking to no one but wolves had made the ancient words feel more natural than the English or Norwegian of her youth. Neither wolf moved toward the door as they normally would. Instead, Skoll tilted his massive head and made a sound she'd never heard before, something between a whine and a chuckle that raised the hair on her arms. Astrid forced herself through the motions anyway. She pulled on her grandmother's hand-knitted wool sweater, the one with the intricate patterns that told stories of ravens and winter gods. Over that went the sealskin coat she'd crafted herself during her 3rd year here, when she'd still believed this exile was temporary. The cold hit her like a physical blow when she stepped outside. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by 3 feet of fresh snow and in silence so complete it felt hostile. The runestones stood in their circle, dark now in the daylight but somehow still present in a way that made her peripheral vision twitch. She made her way to the cache where she stored the wolves' food, fish and seal meat preserved in the traditional way, buried in permafrost and wrapped in birch bark. The work was familiar, meditative. Split the frozen meat with the hand-forged axe, carry it back in the woven grass basket, call to the wolves in the low, musical tones that had always brought them running. But when she turned with their breakfast, Fenris and Skoll hadn't moved from the cabin doorway. They stood like sentinels, breath misting in the frigid air, watching her with expressions that belonged on statues rather than living creatures. "Come," she called, setting down their portions in the spots where they'd eaten every morning for a decade. Fenris Skoll. The names felt strange on her tongue now that she knew their true meaning. Fenris, the wolf destined to devour Odin at Ragnarok. Skoll, the wolf that would swallow the sun. She'd chosen those names as a young woman playing at being a Viking, never imagining. They approached finally, but their movements were wrong, too coordinated, too purposeful. When they began to eat, she noticed their teeth seemed sharper than they had yesterday, their jaws more powerful. Each bite sounded like branches snapping. Astrid returned to her own breakfast. Dried fish, wild berries preserved in seal fat, tea brewed from herbs she'd gathered and dried herself. The simple meal represented hours of work spread across seasons, finding the fish, smoking them properly, identifying which berries wouldn't kill her, learning which plants would heal and which would harm. This life had been built one small victory at a time. When the plague took Ulsfjord, when the authorities came with their hazmat suits and their questions she couldn't answer, when the university sent letters demanding her return that she burned unopened, through all of it, she'd chosen this path, chosen isolation over integration, subsistence over convenience, silence over explanation. She'd been good at it too. Better than good. The scared graduate student who'd fled civilization had become something harder, more capable. She could read weather patterns in cloud formations, predict animal behavior by scent carried on the wind, find food and shelter in landscapes that would kill most people in hours. But watching the wolves finish their meal with movements too controlled, too intelligent, she felt the foundation of her carefully constructed world shifting beneath her feet like spring ice. After breakfast came wood gathering, a task that usually took hours and provided blessed exhaustion. Today, as she pulled her sledge toward the grove of birch trees a kilometer from the cabin, both wolves followed at a precise distance, close enough to observe, far enough to avoid conversation. The grove had been her sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place where she'd often sat among the pale trees and remembered what it felt like to be human. Now, with her silent escorts flanking her like guards, it felt like a cage. As she loaded birch logs onto the sledge, Astrid caught herself glancing toward the distant fjords, wondering what those answering calls in the night had been, wondering what might be coming. The wolf's eyes held the answer, but it was written in a language she was afraid to read. The first log split cleanly under her axe, the crack echoing across the grove like a gunshot. Astrid paused, breathing hard in the thin air, and noticed something that made her stomach clench with dread. Neither wolf had so much as flinched at the sudden noise. For 10 years, loud sounds had triggered their hunting instincts, ears perking, muscles tensing. Now they sat like carved stone, yellow eyes fixed not on her, but on something beyond the tree line. She followed their gaze and saw it, a dark speck moving across the white expanse of the frozen fjord, growing larger with each passing moment. A snowmobile. The mechanical whine reached her ears a heartbeat later. Alien and wrong in this place where the loudest sounds were wind and wolf song. Astrid's hands tightened on the axe handle as primitive panic flooded her system. In 10 years of exile, no one had found her. The few supply drops she'd arranged in the early years had been left at predetermined coordinates 50 kilometers south. This was her sanctuary, her secret place carved from wilderness and will. The snowmobile drew closer, and she could make out a figure hunched over the handlebars, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in modern winter gear that gleamed with technological efficiency. Everything about the approaching stranger screamed civilization, authority, the outside world she'd spent a decade refusing. Fenris rose first, followed by Skoll, their massive forms moving with liquid grace toward the tree line. But instead of positioning themselves protectively near Astrid as they'd done countless times when bears or other predators had wandered too close, they walked toward the approaching stranger. "No," Astrid whispered, then louder, "Fenris, Skoll, come!" The wolves didn't even turn. They reached the edge of the grove and sat in perfect symmetry, 20 feet apart, creating a corridor that led directly to where she stood frozen among the birch trees. An honor guard. The realization hit her like ice water in her veins. They weren't protecting her from the stranger, they were presenting her to him. The snowmobile's engine cut out with mechanical finality, leaving only the whisper of wind through bare branches. The rider pulled off his helmet, revealing a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. His face was weathered but strong, marked by the kind of confidence that came from never doubting your right to be wherever you stood. He looked at the wolves flanking his path, showed no surprise at their size or their unnatural stillness, and began walking toward her with the steady gait of someone following a map. "Astrid Eriksdottir," he called when he was still 30 feet away, his voice carrying easily across the cold air. He spoke in Norwegian, but his accent was strange, old-fashioned, formal. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." She hefted the axe, its familiar weight a comfort against the wrongness of this moment. "My land. You're trespassing." "Your land?" The stranger smiled, and something about the expression made her skin crawl. "This has been Eriksdottir land for 8 centuries. But you're not the first to claim it as yours alone." He reached into his coat, slowly, making no sudden movements, and withdrew a leather portfolio that looked as old as her grandmother's journals. When he opened it, she could see photographs, documents, what looked like genealogical charts covered in spidery handwriting. My name is Dr. Magnus Thorson. I represent certain interests that have been monitoring your family line. He gestured to the wolves, who remained perfectly still. Monitoring and waiting. Astrid's archaeological training kicked in despite her fear, analyzing the papers he held. Even at this distance, she could see symbols that matched the runestones, family trees that stretched back centuries, photographs that looked far older than photography should allow. The plague, she said, the words emerging without conscious thought. You know what really happened to my village? Plague? Thorson's laugh was like breaking glass. That's what you call it? What killed 47 people in a single night, yet left you and your companions untouched? The wolves turned to look at her then, yellow eyes gleaming with intelligence that had nothing to do with animal instinct. In that gaze, she saw acknowledgement, patience, and something that might have been sympathy. The awakening has begun, Thorson continued, moving closer with each word. The stones have sung, haven't they? The old words are translating themselves in your mind. Your guardians are remembering their true nature. They're not guardians, Astrid whispered, though even as she spoke, she knew it was a lie. Aren't they? Then why haven't they aged in 10 years? Why do they understand Old Norse better than most scholars? Why did they lead you to this exact spot, at this exact time? Thorson was close enough now that she could see her reflection in his pale eyes. The last daughter of the last bloodline, isolated and prepared for what's coming. The axe trembled in her hands. What's coming? Thorson smiled again, and this time she saw teeth that seemed too sharp, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The ending of all things. And you get to choose whether to open the door or be dragged through it. The axe slipped from Astrid's numb fingers, landing in the snow with a soft thud that seemed to echo through her bones. She stared at Thorson, at his too sharp smile and animal eyes, and felt the last threads of her carefully maintained sanity beginning to fray. No, the word escaped as barely a whisper. She shook her head, backing against the nearest birch tree until its bark pressed rough and real against her spine. No, I won't choose anything. I don't want any part of this. Thorson's expression shifted to something that might have been pity. Want has nothing to do with it, child. Your bloodline was chosen before the first stones were carved, before the first words of ending were spoken. You think your exile here was your decision? I chose this life. But even as she said it, memories surfaced like bubbles through dark water. Her grandmother's insistence on teaching her the old skills, the dreams that had plagued her university years, dreams of wolves and winter and voices speaking in languages that predated civilization, the inexplicable pull she'd felt toward this specific location when she'd fled Ulfsfjord's ruins. Had any of it truly been choice? Look at them. Thorson nodded toward Fenris and Skoll. Really look. Against her will, Astrid's gaze fell on the wolves. In the pale daylight, she could see details that 10 years of daily companionship had somehow never revealed. The way their proportions were just slightly wrong, too large, too perfectly symmetrical, the intelligence in their eyes that went beyond even the smartest animals she'd studied, the fact that in a decade of harsh Arctic living, neither showed signs of aging beyond the subtle shift from the cubs she'd found to the magnificent creatures before her. Creatures that had never truly been wolves at all. They're beautiful, aren't they? Thorson's voice carried an odd note of reverence. Ancient beyond measure, patient beyond human comprehension. They've been waiting so long for this moment. Waiting to do what? The question tore from her throat like a scream. To fulfill their purpose, as have you. He gestured to the leather portfolio in his hands. 8 centuries of careful breeding, of preserving the bloodline, of ensuring that when the time came, there would be one left who could open the way. Your grandmother knew. Her grandmother before her, all the way back to the first Eriksdottir daughter who made the pact. Astrid's legs gave out. She slid down the birch tree until she sat in the snow, her breath coming in sharp puffs that dissipated like her crumbling certainties. What pact? Power in exchange for service, protection for the bloodline in exchange for eventual payment. Thorson crouched beside her, close enough that she could smell something wild and dangerous beneath his civilized exterior. The plague that took Ulsfjord wasn't meant to kill you, Astrid. It was meant to isolate you, to strip away everything that might interfere with your preparation. The memories came flooding back. Neighbors falling in the streets, her parents collapsing in their own kitchen while she remained untouched. She'd thought it was luck, some cruel twist of fate that had spared her. But if Thorson was right, you murdered them. The words came out broken, barely human. 47 people, my family, everyone I ever knew. I didn't murder anyone. Thorson's voice remained maddeningly calm. The gods required a sacrifice to begin the awakening. Your people were honored to serve that purpose. They didn't choose to serve anything. Neither did you. And yet here we are. Fenris moved then, padding through the snow until he sat directly in front of her. Up close, his eyes held depths that belonged to glacier-carved canyons rather than living creatures. When he leaned forward and rested his massive head against her shoulder, the gesture felt like mockery of every moment of comfort he'd provided over the years. How many times had she whispered her fears to him in the dark Arctic nights? How many times had she shared her food, her warmth, her desperate need for companionship with creatures who had been watching, waiting, reporting back to forces she couldn't comprehend? I won't do it, she said, though her voice lacked conviction even to her own ears. Whatever you want me to do, whatever this opening means, I refuse. Thorson laughed, the sound like winter wind through dead leaves. You think refusal is an option? The process has already begun. The stones are singing, your guardians are awakening. Every moment you delay simply makes the inevitable more violent. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble rolled across the landscape, not quite thunder, not quite earthquake, but something that seemed to emanate from the bones of the world itself. In the distance, she could see the runestones beginning to glow even in the daylight, their ancient symbols pulsing with the rhythm of a vast alien heartbeat. Skoll raised his head and howled, a sound that held harmonies no earthly throat should produce. Somewhere across the fjords, other voices answered, dozens of them, growing closer. The pack gathers, Thorson murmured. And time grows short. The answering howls multiplied across the fjords like an avalanche of sound, each voice distinct yet harmonized in ways that made Astrid's teeth ache. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the otherworldly symphony seemed to resonate through her bones rather than her eardrums. How many? She whispered. Enough. Thorson stood, brushing snow from his knees with casual efficiency. They've been sleeping in ice caves and forgotten valleys, waiting for the call. Your bloodline awakens them, Astrid. You are the key that turns in a lock forged before Christianity reached these shores. She struggled to her feet, using the birch tree for support. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The wolves, her guardians, her captors, flanked her like living walls. Beyond them, Thorson watched with the patience of someone who had waited centuries and could wait centuries more. What happens if I refuse? The question felt absurd even as she asked it. The ancient forces gathering around her didn't seem inclined to accept human objections. The opening occurs regardless. But without your willing participation, without the proper rituals, Thorson tilted his head, considering. The barriers between worlds don't dissolve cleanly, they shatter. The resulting chaos would make Ragnarok look like a spring rain. Another rumble shook the earth, stronger this time. Behind Thorson, his snowmobile's metal frame began to vibrate with a resonance that had nothing to do with wind. In the distance, the runestones pulsed brighter, their glow visible even against the pale Arctic daylight. Astrid thought of her carefully built life, the cabin she'd constructed log by log, the routines that had kept her sane, the illusion of choice that had sustained her through a decade of exile. All of it crumbling like ice in spring melt. Show me, she heard herself say. Thorson's eyebrows rose. Show you what? The truth. All of it. Her voice grew stronger, though her hands still shook. If I'm supposed to end the world, I want to know exactly what I'm ending it for. Fenris and Skoll moved in perfect synchronization, stepping aside to create a clear path between Astrid and Thorson. The gesture felt ceremonial, weighted with significance that made her stomach clench. Thorson opened his leather portfolio fully, revealing documents that seemed to shift and writhe in the cold air. The topmost page showed a family tree with her name at the bottom. Astrid Eriksdottir, last of her line. Above her, generations of women bearing the same surname, stretching back through centuries until the names became unpronounceable combinations of Old Norse syllables. Your ancestor, Sigrid the Far-Seer, made the initial bargain during the last great winter. His finger traced the ancient names. Famine had come to the north. The old gods were weak, forgotten. She offered her bloodline as a bridge, a way for them to return when the world had forgotten their power. The photographs beneath the genealogy made Astrid's breath catch. They showed the same runestones she'd lived beside for 10 years, but arranged differently. In a perfect circle around a raised dais carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Women stood at various points in the circle, hands raised toward a sky split by unnatural aurora. Each generation, one daughter. Each daughter, a key turned a little further. Thorson's voice took on a ritualistic cadence. Your grandmother performed her role during the war years. Your mother during the Cold War's height, each awakening stronger than the last. What was their role? Though part of her already knew. To thin the barriers, to prepare the way, to ensure that when the final daughter came, the path would be clear. He flipped to another page, this one showing her own image, a photograph that couldn't exist because she'd been completely isolated for a decade. In the picture, she stood in her cabin doorway at night, but her eyes glowed with the same ethereal light as the runestones. Behind her, shadows moved that had too many teeth, too many angles, too much substance for natural darkness. This was taken last night, Thorson said quietly. The process has already begun. The howling reached a crescendo that made the air itself vibrate. Across the fjords, she could see shapes moving, wolves the size of horses, dozens of them, converging on her location with supernatural speed. Astrid closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 8 centuries pressing down on her shoulders. When she opened them again, Fenris and Skoll had moved closer, their eyes now glowing with that same terrible light she'd seen in her photograph. If I do this willingly, she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, if I perform whatever ritual you need, can you guarantee the ending will be clean? No unnecessary suffering? Thorson's smile held genuine warmth for the first time. As clean as any ending can be. The old gods are not cruel by nature, merely inevitable. She nodded once, the gesture feeling like a stone dropped into deep water. No splash, just the certainty of irrevocable descent. Then show me the way. Thorson's portfolio vanished into his coat with practiced efficiency, but when his hands emerged, they held something far older. A bone-handled knife whose blade seemed to drink the pale daylight. The metal was inscribed with the same symbols that adorned the runestones, but these moved and shifted like living things carved in steel. The ritual requires 3 elements, he said, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ancient instruction. Blood of the willing daughter, words of the first pact, and witnesses to bear the weight of opening. As if responding to some unheard signal, the approaching pack began to crest the hills surrounding Astrid's sanctuary. She had expected massive wolves, but what emerged from the tree lines defied even her expanded understanding of impossibility. They moved like liquid shadow given form, their bodies shifting between wolf and something far older, creatures that might have hunted when the world was young, and gods walked among mortals. Fenris and Skoll rose, their own transformations becoming apparent as they stood beside their kin, their forms stretched upward, proportions becoming even more unnaturally perfect, until they towered above her like monuments to predation itself. They're beautiful, Astrid whispered, surprising herself. Terror warred with awe as she watched the pack arrange itself in a perfect circle around the grove. Each creature found its position with mathematical precision, creating a living mandala of eyes that reflected starlight despite the daylight hour. The Einherjar, Thorson said reverently. Odin's chosen hunters, sleeping until the final hunt. They have guarded your bloodline through 8 centuries of waiting. The bone knife felt heavier in his hands now, as though the approaching ritual was lending it substance. But first, you must understand the price. The old gods do not return gently. Their awakening will crack the foundations of this ordered world. A new voice spoke from behind them, melodious, speaking accented English with perfect precision, which is why she will not face this trial alone. Astrid spun to see a woman emerging from between the birch trees, moving with a grace that suggested familiarity with far stranger forests than this one. She appeared to be in her 40s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes the color of deep forest shadow. Her clothing was anachronistic, layers of wool and fur that belonged to no particular era, cut in patterns that suggested both practicality and ritual significance. "Dr. Elena Vasquez," the woman said, offering a slight bow, "cultural anthropologist, practitioner of the old ways, and representative of those who remember what came before your gods." Thorsson's composure cracked for the first time since his arrival. "This is not your concern, witch, isn't it?" Elena moved closer, and Astrid noticed that the pack, despite their supernatural stillness, tracked her movement with something approaching wariness. When Norse gods wake, they do not limit their appetite to Norse lands. The child deserves to understand her alternatives before she opens doors that cannot be closed. The runestones' pulsing light intensified, as if responding to the tension between the two figures. Elena reached into her own satchel, worn leather that looked as ancient as Thorsson's portfolio, and withdrew what appeared to be a simple stone circle no larger than her palm. "A binding circle," she explained to Astrid, "carved from the same bedrock as your ancestors' stones, but inscribed with different intentions. Containment rather than opening, control rather than surrender." "Impossible," Thorsson snarled. "The pact cannot be broken. 8 centuries of preparation. Cannot be undone, no, but it can be redirected." Elena's smile held secrets that made even the Einherjar shift uneasily. The gods wished to return, but they never specified how much of this world they required. A controlled opening, a limited manifestation, might satisfy the terms while preserving what exists. Astrid found herself caught between impossible choices as the weight of both options settled over her. Around them, the pack began to pace in their perfect circle, a living clock counting down to some inevitable moment. The air itself felt thick with potential, as though reality was holding its breath. "What would that mean?" she asked Elena. "A limited opening?" "The gods return, but bound by new terms. Their power constrained to specific territories, their influence limited by willing cooperation rather than absolute dominion." Elena's eyes met Astrid's directly. "You would still serve as the key, but you would also become the lock." Thorsson raised the bone knife, its blade now humming with visible energy. "These are the desperate lies of those who fear change. The old ways demand old prices, child. Half measures will only ensure that when the barriers finally break, and they will break, the chaos will be absolute." The howling began again, but this time it carried words in languages that predated human speech. Fenris and Skoll added their voices to the chorus, their song weaving through harmonies that made Astrid's vision blur with sudden understanding. She was the fulcrum on which everything balanced, the choice that would determine whether the ending came as controlled demolition or catastrophic collapse. And time was running out. The weight of decision pressed against Astrid's chest like a physical thing. Around them, the Einherjar continued their measured pacing, their forms casting shadows that moved independently of their bodies. The air crackled with competing energies, Thorsson's ancient certainty and Elena's desperate innovation, creating a tension that made her teeth ache. "How long?" Astrid's voice came out rougher than intended. "How long do I have to choose?" Elena glanced at the pulsing runestones, their light now bright enough to cast colored shadows across the snow. "Minutes. The convergence peaks with the sun's zenith, and in this season—" She checked the sky where the pale disk hung low but climbing. "Not long." Thorsson's laugh held no warmth. "You speak as though choice remains relevant. Look around you, child. The ritual has already begun." He was right. The changes were accelerating beyond any possibility of reversal. The pack's circling had carved visible grooves in the earth, grooves that glowed with the same eldritch light as the stones. Fenris and Skoll had begun to emit a low harmonic hum that seemed to resonate in her bones, and when Astrid looked down at her hands, she could see faint traceries of light running along her veins like luminous tattoos. "The blood remembers," Elena said softly, following her gaze. 8 centuries of preparation have changed you at levels deeper than conscious thought. But that same blood gives you power over the process itself. Power? Astrid's laugh bordered on hysteria. "I can barely understand what's happening, let alone control it." "Then let me show you." Elena stepped closer, her movements careful but determined. The Einherjar tensed, massive forms coiling like springs, but she ignored them completely. "Give me your hand." Thorson moved to intercede, the bone knife gleaming with lethal intent, but Elena's words stopped him cold. "Touch me with that blade, and you'll shatter the very foundations you seek to unlock. The ritual requires willing blood, not spilled in violence." The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire. Astrid could feel the moment balanced on knife's edge. One wrong move and everything would cascade beyond any hope of guidance. The howling around them intensified, voices from across the fjords adding to the supernatural chorus until the air itself seemed to sing. She extended her hand to Elena. The anthropologist's touch was warm, startlingly human after the otherworldly energies surrounding them. But when their skin made contact, Astrid's vision exploded with possibilities. Fractal paths branching through space and time, each one showing a different outcome of the choice before her. In one path, she saw herself taking Thorson's knife willingly, opening her veins to feed the hungry stones. The barriers between worlds dissolved like mist, and ancient forms stepped through, gods terrible in their beauty, their presence remaking reality according to older laws. Cities became forests, technology crumbled to rust, and humanity learned to worship again under skies that showed 3 moons. In another, she watched herself refusing entirely. The convergence continued without her willing participation, but the opening became a rupture, violent, uncontrolled, catastrophic. The gods returned as conquerors rather than inhabitants, their rage at the delay expressed in earthquakes that split continents and storms that boiled the seas. But there was a third path, narrow and dangerous, where Elena's binding circle glowed with its own power. Here, the opening still occurred, but constrained, limited. The gods emerged into carefully prepared sanctuaries, their influence bounded by ancient laws and modern will. The world changed, but did not end. "You see?" Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The pact binds them as much as it binds you. They must accept the terms you offer, as long as some opening is provided." The vision faded, leaving Astrid gasping in the cold air. Around them, the Einherjar had stopped their pacing and now stood motionless as standing stones, waiting. Even Fenris and Skoll had gone still, their glowing eyes fixed on her with an intensity that suggested they too understood the moment's significance. Thorson stepped forward, his composure cracked but his purpose unwavering. "Pretty pictures, but meaningless. The gods will not be caged by human cleverness. They will take what was promised, full return, complete restoration. Anything less is betrayal of the highest order. And if she chooses betrayal..." Elena's challenge rang across the grove like a bell. "What then? Will you force the blood from her veins? Murder the last daughter and ensure the pact dies with her?" The question hung in the air while the runestones pulsed brighter, their light now visible as pillar-straight beams reaching toward the climbing sun. Astrid could feel the pressure building, reality itself straining under the weight of forces too long contained. She closed her eyes and listened to her heartbeat, steady, human, mortal. When she opened them again, both Elena and Thorson were watching her with the intensity of those who knew their fates hung on her words. The choice was hers, but time had run out for contemplation. The convergence had begun. The convergence erupted around them with the violence of a dam bursting. The moment Astrid opened her eyes, the runestones exploded into pillars of light that tore through the pale sky like divine spears. The Einherjar threw back their massive heads and howled in unison, a sound that shattered the natural order and sent cracks spreading through the very air. Reality began to fracture along those luminous fissures, revealing glimpses of something vast and hungry pressing against the boundaries of the world. Astrid staggered as power flooded through her bloodline connection, every cell in her body suddenly ablaze with ancient purpose. The traceries of light in her veins flared brilliant blue, mapping her circulatory system in supernatural fire. She could feel 8 centuries of accumulated energy demanding release, her ancestors' sacrifices crying out for fulfillment. "Choose now!" Thorson shouted over the cosmic din, the bone knife blazing in his grip. The opening will not wait for human hesitation. But choice had become academic. The convergence was tearing control away from all of them, mortal concerns swept aside by forces that had been building since before the first Viking ship touched foreign shores. The ground beneath their feet began to buckle and reform, ancient symbols carving themselves into the earth with strokes of liquid fire. Elena grabbed Astrid's arm, her binding circle now pulsing with desperate energy. "The gods are coming through whether we guide them or not. If you don't act—" Her words cut off as Fenris and Skoll suddenly lurched toward Astrid, their forms expanding beyond the merely enormous into something that defied perspective. Their eyes had become twin stars, burning with intelligence so alien that looking directly into them sent spikes of madness through her mind. When they opened their mouths, the darkness inside held glimpses of cosmic void, spaces between worlds where things older than gods waited in patient hunger. This was her greatest fear made manifest, not just the loss of control, but the discovery that control had always been an illusion. For 10 years she had convinced herself that isolation meant safety, that if she asked nothing of the world, it would ask nothing of her. But the blood remembered what her conscious mind had tried to forget. She had never been raising wolves, she had been feeding weapons, she had never been a hermit. She had been a key, carefully maintained and precisely positioned for this moment of ultimate turning. "They're not my companions," she whispered, the truth hitting her with physical force. "They're my wardens." The massive wolves, no, the Einherjar, Odin's chosen destroyers, pressed closer, their presence a wall of supernatural pressure that made breathing an act of will. She could feel their hunger, not for flesh, but for the completion of purpose. They had waited 8 centuries for this moment, and their patience was ending whether she cooperated or not. Above them, the sky began to tear. Long rents appeared in the blue, edges crackling with energy that hurt to perceive. Through those impossible wounds, shapes moved, vast forms that existed in more dimensions than human vision could process. A hand the size of a mountain reached through one fissure, fingers trailing aurora as they grasped for purchase in this reality. Where they touched the air, space itself began to crystallize into new configurations. The gods were coming, and the world was reshaping itself to accommodate their return. Astrid felt the bone knife's hunger like a physical ache in her chest. Every drop of her blood was crying out for release, for the completion of the bargain that had shaped her entire lineage. But Elena's binding circle pulsed with its own insistent rhythm, offering a different path, not escape, but negotiation. "The terms!" Elena screamed, her voice barely audible over the reality storm. "You can still set the terms!" But could she? The forces unleashed around them felt far beyond any mortal's ability to constrain. The Einherjar had begun to pace again, but now their movement was creating geometric patterns that burned themselves into the landscape, ritual, forms that would channel the emerging god's power into specific configurations. She was seeing the skeleton of a new world being carved into existence, and every step brought them closer to a point of no return. Thorson raised the bone knife high, its blade now streaming with otherworldly fire. "The blood calls, daughter of Sigrid, will you answer as your ancestors did, or will you doom us all to chaos?" The weight of 8 centuries pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every woman in her line had faced this choice, had added their sacrifice to the growing power. Her grandmother had bled for this moment, her mother had died for it, and now the accumulated debt had come due in full. But as the sky continued to tear and impossible forms pressed closer to manifestation, Astrid realized the most terrifying truth of all. There was no choice that would return the world to what it had been. The only question was whether the ending would come as symphony or cacophony. The gods were coming home, and she was the door they would walk through, willing or not. The decision was torn from her hands by betrayal. Elena's scream shattered the Convergence's roar, not words of encouragement, but pure agony. Astrid spun to see the anthropologist's body convulsing, her binding circle now blazing with malevolent red light instead of protective silver. The stone disk was burning through her palms, searing flesh with symbols that rewrote themselves as Astrid watched. "It was never meant to bind them," Elena gasped, her face contorting as understanding dawned too late. "It was meant to bind me, to ensure no interference." The circle exploded in her hands, sending shards of cursed stone deep into her chest. She collapsed, blood pooling beneath her, as the last alternative to Thorsson's ritual died with her deception. "The old ways demand old prices," Thorsson said with grim satisfaction. "Did you think 8 centuries of preparation could be undone by modern cleverness?" But even as Elena's betrayal crumbled around them, something far worse was happening to Fenris and Skoll. The wolves, her companions, her family, her only connection to anything resembling love in 10 years of isolation, were dissolving. Their forms wavered like heat mirages, the familiar shapes she had fed and sheltered and spoken to through countless lonely nights, fragmenting into geometric patterns of light and shadow. Underneath the dissolving wolf flesh, something else was emerging, the true forms of the Einherjar, and they were magnificent and terrible beyond comprehension. Astrid whispered, reaching toward Fenris as his amber eyes, the eyes that had watched her through nightmares and shared her meals, flickered and went out forever. "You can't take them. They're all I have." But they were already gone. The creatures that stood before her now bore no resemblance to the cubs she had rescued, the packmates who had kept her sane through years of self-imposed exile. These were weapons of divine will, their wolf shapes nothing more than camouflage that had served its purpose. She had been speaking to empty vessels, loving illusions designed to keep her compliant until this moment. The Einherjar towered above her now in their true forms, beings of crystalline bone and stellar fire, their faces bearing the geometric perfection of mathematical equations made flesh. When they looked at her, there was no recognition, no warmth, no memory of the woman who had hand-fed them scraps and sung them to sleep during storms. She had lost everything in the space of heartbeats. Her only ally revealed as another manipulator. Her beloved wolves revealed as hollow constructs. Her 10 years of carefully built isolation revealed as elaborate imprisonment. The blood, daughter. Thorsson's voice carried new authority as the convergence reached its peak. Around them, the Einherjar began their final positioning, each movement carving reality into shapes that would receive the emerging gods. There is no path but forward now. Astrid felt the bone knife's pull like gravity, her bloodline screaming for completion of the ancient pact. But even as her body moved toward Thorsson with dreamlike inevitability, her mind reeled with the magnitude of her failure. Every choice she had made, from her self-imposed exile to her fierce protection of the wolves to her desperate attempt to find an alternative, had been anticipated, guided, used. She had never been in control. She had been a component in someone else's machine, carefully maintained and perfectly manipulated. The sky above them had become a map of tears, each fissure revealing glimpses of the approaching gods. A face the size of a fjord pressed against one opening, its features carved from living storm cloud and stellar radiation. When it spoke, the words came not as sound, but as alterations to the fundamental laws of physics, rewriting local reality to accommodate meanings that had no human translation. The compact nears fulfillment, it said, and mountains moved to form the syllables. The daughter of Sigrid will complete what was begun. Astrid felt her grandmother's name like a chain around her throat. 800 years of women had died for this moment, their lives spent like coins to purchase divine attention, and she was the final payment, the last coin to be offered up. But even as Thorsson reached for her with the blazing knife, even as the Einherjar closed their circle to prevent any possibility of escape, even as the gods pressed closer to manifestation through wounds in the world's flesh, Astrid felt something new stirring in the ruins of her certainty. Not hope exactly. Hope had died with Elena's betrayal and the revelation of the wolves' true nature, but something harder, more bitter, and infinitely more dangerous. If she had never possessed real choice, if every moment of her life had been orchestrated by forces beyond her comprehension, then she had nothing left to lose, no relationships to preserve, no illusions to protect, no future to safeguard. She was free in the way that only the completely destroyed could be free. And that freedom might be the one thing they had not planned for. The bone knife descended toward her throat, and in that crystal moment between heartbeats, Astrid finally understood. Not the nature of the pact that had been made clear through pain and revelation, not the identity of her captors, their divine signatures burned across the fractured sky. The understanding that flooded through her was far more fundamental, a recognition that rewrote everything she thought she knew about power, sacrifice, and the true meaning of 8 centuries of orchestrated death. They needed her willing. The realization struck like lightning through her consciousness as Thorsson's blade hung suspended inches from her skin. Not her blood, any blade could spill that. Not her death, violence could accomplish that easily enough. They needed her consent, her deliberate participation in the completion of the pact. Every woman in her lineage had chosen to die, and that choice was what gave their sacrifice meaning. Without willing blood, the convergence would tear itself apart. "Stop," she said, and power she never knew she possessed rang through the single word. Thorsson's hand froze as if he'd struck a wall. The Einherjar, poised to close their ritual circle, suddenly found themselves unable to take another step. Even the gods pressing against the barriers of reality seemed to hesitate, their vast forms wavering like reflections in disturbed water. 8 centuries, Astrid continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding deepened. 8 centuries of women who walked willingly to their deaths, convinced they were saving the world. But what if they were wrong? The convergence energy swirled around her, no longer pulling her toward the knife, but responding to something deeper, her refusal to accept the story they had built around her life. The traceries of light in her veins pulsed brighter, but now they felt like chains she could choose to wear or cast off. "The plague that killed my village," she said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place with terrible clarity. "It wasn't random, it wasn't even supernatural. You orchestrated it, killed everyone I knew, just to drive me into isolation so I wouldn't question my destiny." Thorsson's composure cracked. "The sacrifice was necessary. Without your preparation, without my conditioning," Astrid cut him off. 10 years of speaking only to wolves, to your constructs, so I'd forget how to trust human connection, so I'd be desperate enough to believe anyone who offered me answers." She looked at Elena's still form, understanding flooding through her even as her heart broke again. She was never trying to save me. The binding circle, the alternative ritual, another layer of manipulation, make me think I was choosing between bad and worse, when the real choice was whether to choose at all. The god's face in the sky twisted with what might have been anger or amusement. "Clever child, but understanding changes nothing. The compact binds in blood and starlight." "The compact binds the willing," Astrid said, and felt the truth of it resonate through every fiber of her being. "That's why my ancestors had to choose. That's why you needed the isolation, the manipulation, the careful orchestration of every loss. Because forced sacrifice has no power." She turned to face the massive form of Thorsson, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a man driven by duty, but something else wearing human shape, a fragment of divine will pressed into flesh for the sole purpose of ensuring her compliance. "What happens if I refuse?" she asked. "Not if I run, I understand that's impossible now. Not if I fight, I know I can't win. What happens if I simply don't consent?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. The convergence energies continued to swirl, but without direction now, without purpose. The Einherjar stood frozen in their ritual positions, unable to complete patterns that required her willing participation. Even the tears in the sky seemed to stabilize, no longer widening toward the god's emergence. "The convergence will collapse," Thorsson admitted, his stolen human face showing something that might have been fear. The accumulated power will turn inward, seeking release through any available channel, including the blood that called it forth in the first place, Astrid said, understanding the final piece of the trap. My refusal doesn't stop the ending, it just makes it violent, uncontrolled. The gods emerge anyway, but as conquerors rather than inheritors. The terrible beauty of their manipulation revealed itself fully. Willing sacrifice brought them home gently, as promised. Unwilling sacrifice brought them home in rage. Either way, they came home. But there was a third option, one they had worked so carefully to hide from her that she almost missed it even now. She could take the power for herself. 8 centuries of accumulated sacrifice, divine attention, and cosmic forces, all of it flowing through her bloodline, all of it currently without direction as she held the moment in perfect suspension. The gods needed her consent to return home, but that same need gave her leverage over the fundamental forces they represented. She could reshape the bargain entirely. The realization transformed everything, not just her understanding of the situation, but the situation itself. The knife in Thorson's hand began to smoke and crack. The Einherjar's perfect forms wavered like mirages. Even the gods in their celestial wounds seemed to draw back, suddenly uncertain. For the first time in 8 centuries, the pact was truly open to negotiation, and Astrid Eriksdottir finally had something they wanted more than her death. The power hit her like a glacier calving into the sea, massive, inevitable, and utterly transformative. Astrid felt the accumulated force of 8 centuries flow into her blood, each generation's sacrifice becoming fuel for something the gods had never intended. The geometric patterns carved into the landscape began to shift, their meanings rewriting themselves as she claimed ownership of forces that had been flowing through her lineage toward distant divine purposes. This is not possible, the god in the sky rumbled, its mountain-sized features contorting with something that might have been panic. The compact cannot be. The compact can be whatever I choose to make it, Astrid said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the air itself shiver. You needed willing participation. You have it, just not in the way you expected. She reached out with senses that had never existed before the power flooded through her, feeling the threads of divine will that had been manipulating her life like puppet strings. With deliberate precision, she began cutting them one by one. Each severed connection sent shockwaves through the convergence, reality adjusting to accommodate a player the gods had never planned for. Thorson staggered backward, his borrowed flesh beginning to smoke as his divine patron's control weakened. You don't understand the forces you're unleashing. Without proper guidance, the convergence will answer to me, Astrid finished. The bone knife in his hand cracked completely, its blade dissolving into motes of light that spiraled around her like a constellation. That's what you never told them, isn't it? That's what you kept hidden from my grandmother, my mother, every woman who died thinking she was saving the world. The blood magic doesn't require their return. It just requires direction. She could feel the Einherjar's confusion like a discordant note in her expanded awareness. Without the gods to command them, without the familiar ritual to complete, they stood frozen between forms, neither the wolves she had loved nor the weapons they had been shaped to become. In that moment of suspension, she sensed something else, the original spirits of the cubs she had rescued, still buried deep beneath layers of divine manipulation. Fenris, she whispered, reaching toward the nearest Einherjar with power instead of her hand. Skoll. The crystalline forms shuddered. For a heartbeat, amber eyes flickered within the geometric perfection of their faces. Not the stellar fire of divine weapons, but the warm intelligence of creatures who had shared her isolation and trusted her completely. They were still there, trapped beneath 8 centuries of accumulated purpose. She pulled them free. The extraction tore through the convergence like a blade through silk. The Einherjar's false forms collapsed, divine architecture dissolving as she reclaimed what had always belonged to her. What emerged from the wreckage were her wolves again, not cubs now, but something between their original selves and the power they had been forced to channel. They were larger than any natural wolf, their eyes holding depths that spoke of divine fire, voluntarily accepted rather than imposed. But when Fenris pressed against her side, the gesture was pure canine affection. Impossible, Thorson breathed, his form beginning to fragment as his divine patron's fury reached him across celestial distances. You cannot unmake 8 centuries of preparation. I'm not unmaking anything, Astrid said, her awareness expanding to encompass the full scope of the convergence. She could feel every thread of power, every accumulated sacrifice, every carefully laid plan stretching back to the first woman who had bled for divine promises. I'm fulfilling it, just not for you. The god in the sky roared, the sound reshaping local geography as mountains cracked and new fjords carved themselves into existence. The compact binds you to us. You cannot— The compact binds us together, Astrid corrected, and began to pull. If they wanted to use her bloodline as an anchor to physical reality, she would give them exactly that, but as prisoner rather than passenger. The power flowing through her reached across the dimensional barriers, grasping the gods not to invite them home, but to drag them into configurations of her choosing. They had made themselves dependent on her consent. Now she would teach them what dependence truly meant. The tears in the sky began to close, but not because the gods were withdrawing. They were being compressed, forced into smaller and smaller spaces as she redefined the parameters of their manifestation. Instead of emerging as conquerors of a reshaped world, they found themselves constrained within the boundaries of her will. A new compact, she announced, her voice carrying across realities. You want to come home? Then you come as I allow, when I allow, serving purposes I choose. Elena's body stirred at the edge of her vision, the anthropologist's wounds healing as runoff power from the transformation washed over her. She sat up slowly, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Astrid, she whispered, what have you done? What I should have done from the beginning, Astrid replied, feeling the last of the divine control threads snap beneath her will. I've taken control of my own story. The convergence continued around them, but its destination had changed entirely. The moment her declaration ended, the consequences came roaring back like a tide. Astrid felt the full weight of what she had chosen settle into her bones. 8 centuries of accumulated power now flowing through a mortal frame never meant to contain such forces. Her skin began to crack along the lines where runic light pulsed strongest, silver fire bleeding through fractures in her humanity. The wolves pressed closer, their enhanced forms radiating concern, but even they seemed diminished next to what she was becoming. You're burning yourself out, Elena said, struggling to her feet. The anthropologist's face was pale but determined as she approached the epicenter of the convergence. The human body can't channel that much divine energy without becoming something else, Astrid finished, watching her hands transform before her eyes. The flesh was hardening into something between bone and crystal, beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman. I know, but there was no turning back now. The gods thrashed against the constraints she had imposed, their rage sending ripples through reality that made the landscape flex like water. Each wave of divine fury threatened to tear apart the bindings she had crafted, and maintaining them required more power than any mortal could safely wield. She was winning, but victory might kill her as surely as surrender. Thorson's form had completely destabilized, his borrowed flesh dissolving as his patron's connection severed. But his voice carried across the chaos with prophetic certainty. You have doomed more than yourself, Eriksdottir. The gods will not forget this binding. They will scheme and manipulate until they find another bloodline, another anchor. And next time, they will not underestimate mortal will. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had trapped the gods, yes, but only temporarily. Divine beings measured time in millennia, not decades. They could afford to wait, to plan, to slowly corrupt whatever new bloodline they chose for their next attempt at manifestation. Her victory was personal, not permanent, unless she finished what she had started. The realization crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. She could not simply bind the gods and hope the constraints would hold forever. She had to complete the convergence on her own terms, not to bring them home as conquerors, but to drag them fully into physical reality where they could be dealt with permanently. Elena, she said, her transformed voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "The binding circle you created, it wasn't just to contain me, was it? You designed it to focus and amplify whatever power passed through it." The anthropologist's eyes widened with understanding. "Astrid, no. If you channel the full convergence through yourself—" "I'll die," Astrid agreed. "But so will they. Divine beings can't maintain cohesion in physical reality without an anchor. If I force them completely through the dimensional barriers and then shatter that anchor—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Elena understood the implications as clearly as she did. The gods would manifest fully, becoming vulnerable for the first time in millennia, and then burn away to nothing when their earthly tether destroyed itself. Fenris whined low in his throat, pressing against her crystallizing form. Through the bond that transcended their transformed nature, she felt his desperate desire for her to find another way. But there was no other way. The convergence had too much momentum to simply stop, and partial manifestation would leave the gods weakened but not destroyed. It had to be everything or nothing. "Get back," she told Elena, power already beginning to build toward critical mass. "Get as far from here as you can." Instead, the anthropologist stepped closer. "There might be another way. If we could redirect the energy, spread it across multiple anchors instead of concentrating it in one person." "There are no other anchors," Astrid said, feeling the first gods beginning to manifest in response to her pull. They came unwillingly, fighting every step of the transition, but the power flowing through her was too strong to resist. 8 centuries of preparation, remember? I'm the only one who can channel this much accumulated force. The sky above them had become a battlefield of light and shadow, as divine forms pressed through dimensional barriers. But these were not the triumphant arrivals they had planned. They came as prisoners being dragged to execution, their forms already beginning to fragment from forced contact with physical reality. Elena grabbed her arm, or tried to. Her hand passed through crystallizing flesh that was more energy than matter now. "Astrid, please, there has to be—" "Take care of them," Astrid interrupted, glancing at the wolves who watched her transformation with eyes full of understanding and grief. "They chose to follow me into this. Make sure they have a life worth living when it's over." The final phase of the convergence began, reality bending around her as she prepared to complete the most ambitious magical working in human history. Above them, the gods' screams of rage became screams of terror as they realized what she intended. The road back had led her here, to a choice between personal survival and cosmic justice. She chose justice. The moment Astrid completed her choice, the universe responded with violence. Divine forms materialized above the fjord in a cascade of unwilling manifestation. Odin with his ravens screaming protests into the wind, Thor's hammer crackling with impotent lightning, Freya's beauty twisted into something terrible by forced incarnation. They had expected to emerge as conquerors reclaiming a prepared world. Instead, they found themselves dragged through dimensional barriers like fish hauled from deep water, their eternal forms struggling to maintain cohesion in a reality that rejected their presence. Astrid felt every one of them fight her pull, their combined resistance threatening to tear her consciousness apart. The power required to force gods into unwilling manifestation exceeded anything her transformed body could safely channel. Silver fire now bled from every pore, her crystalline flesh cracking under pressures that rewrote local physics with each heartbeat. "The anchor point is destabilizing," Elena shouted over the cosmic storm, her voice barely audible above the god's rage. "You're pulling too much through too fast." But Astrid could not slow down. She had learned something in 10 years of isolation that the gods in their eternal arrogance had never understood. Sometimes, the only way to break a chain was to pull it tight enough to snap. They had made themselves dependent on her bloodline, convinced that need guaranteed their victory. Now that same dependence became their weakness. Odin's single eye fixed on her with fury that could have ignited atmospheres. "You know not what you do, child. Without us, the cosmic order will survive just fine." Astrid cut him off, feeling his divine essence compress under her will. "Your absence didn't break the world for 8 centuries. Your return won't heal it." Thor raised Mjolnir, lightning gathering around him in preparation for a strike that could level mountains. But when he brought the hammer down, it met something that hadn't existed moments before, a barrier woven from the same power that was transforming Astrid, feeding on his own divine essence to strengthen itself. The impact sent shockwaves through the manifestation, but the barrier held. Because she was not fighting them as a mortal challenging gods. She was fighting them as the anchor they had spent centuries learning to depend upon, using their own need against them. Freya attempted a different approach, her voice carrying enchantments that had toppled kingdoms. Child of Midgard, you could join us willingly. Share in our eternal nature rather than burning yourself away in futile defiance. I've seen your idea of sharing, Astrid replied, gesturing toward the wolves who stood vigil at the edge of the convergence zone. My companions spent 8 centuries as your weapons, their true selves buried beneath layers of imposed purpose. Everything you touch becomes a tool for your desires. The goddess's beautiful features twisted with something uglier than rage, the petulant fury of a being unused to having its will denied. She struck out with power that could reshape continents, but like Thor's hammer, her assault met barriers that fed on her own strength. Each attack only made Astrid's bindings more powerful, but the cost was becoming visible. Where Astrid's feet touched the ground, the stone was beginning to glass over from the heat her transformation generated. The runic light that had once traced gentle patterns along her skin now blazed like trapped starfire, and each pulse sent fresh cracks spreading through her crystalline flesh. The manifestation is 90% complete, Elena called out, consulting instruments that sparked and failed in the convergence's electromagnetic chaos. But you're losing structural integrity. At this rate, I have maybe 2 minutes before total collapse, Astrid agreed, feeling her consciousness begin to fray at the edges, which should be exactly enough time. She reached deeper into the power flowing through her bloodline, calling up forces that her ancestors had accumulated across centuries of sacrifice. But instead of offering that power to the gods as intended, she wrapped it around them like chains. Each divine form found itself bound not just to physical reality, but to the mortal anchor that was destroying itself to contain them. The gods' resistance reached a crescendo of desperate fury. They struck at her simultaneously. 9 divine beings channeling the combined wrath of eternal powers through attacks that should have unmade her instantly. The landscape around the fjord reshaped itself under the assault, new mountains rising while others crumbled to dust. But Astrid held. The bindings held. And with each passing second, the gods found themselves more thoroughly trapped in forms that physical reality was slowly poisoning. Odin's voice carried a note she had never expected to hear from a deity. Fear. Release us, and we will withdraw completely. No more bloodlines, no more manipulations. Eternal exile in exchange for nothing, Astrid said, feeling her vision begin to fracture as her transformed senses reached their limits. You had your chance for negotiation. Now you face judgment. The final phase began. Above them, 9 gods screamed in unison as she prepared to complete the convergence that would destroy them all. The convergence reached critical mass in a cascade of collapsing realities. Astrid felt her consciousness shatter into 9 separate awareness streams, each one locked in direct confrontation with a manifestation of divine will that had shaped mortal existence for millennia. Through fragmenting vision, she saw Odin's ravens dive toward her eyes, not as birds but as living shadows intent on tearing her mind apart from within. She caught them in crystalline hands that moved faster than thought, crushing wings made of compressed starlight until they dissolved into shrieking echoes. Thor's hammer fell again, this time bypassing her barriers to strike directly at the source of her power. The impact should have obliterated her instantly. Instead, it met the accumulated fury of every woman in her bloodline who had died believing in divine promises. 8 centuries of sacrifice rose up like a tide, turning his own strength back on him until the god of thunder staggered under the weight of mortal grief made manifest. You cannot unmake us, Freya's voice carried across dimensions, her beauty now terrible as nuclear fire. "We are eternal. We are—" "Parasites," Astrid finished, feeling her crystalline form begin its final transformation. The flesh was gone now, replaced entirely by something between living geometry and concentrated will. "You're parasites who convinced your hosts they were blessed." She pulled harder on the convergence, dragging the remaining gods through dimensional barriers that screamed like wounded animals. Tyr emerged with his sword already drawn, the blade singing with harmonics that could cut through the foundations of reality. But when he struck, Astrid's form simply reconfigured around the attack, her crystalline structure, flowing like water made of light. Because she was no longer fighting them as a mortal, the transformation had progressed beyond humanity, beyond anything that could be killed by conventional divine power. She had become a living expression of the convergence itself, not its anchor, but its inevitable conclusion. The gods realized their error too late. "She's not trying to survive the binding." Odin's voice carried new understanding, terrible in its clarity. "She's becoming the binding itself." Astrid felt her individual consciousness fragment further, spreading across multiple layers of reality as she wrapped herself around each divine form like a living cage. Where her crystalline essence touched them, their eternal nature began to change, not destroyed, but redefined according to parameters she set moment by moment. Baldur's light dimmed as she compressed his radiance into spectrums invisible to mortal eyes. Loki's shape-shifting abilities turned inward, his form cycling through transformations that followed patterns she imposed rather than his chaotic will. One by one, the gods found themselves becoming something they had never been: limited. "The binding is holding." Elena's voice reached her across impossible distances, the anthropologist somehow maintaining her instruments despite reality's ongoing collapse. "But the feedback is approaching cascade failure. Astrid, you need to complete the process now." But completion meant choosing the gods' final fate, and that decision carried weight beyond anything she had imagined. Through her fragmented awareness, she saw the full scope of what they represented, not just divine beings, but fundamental forces that had shaped reality for eons. Their complete destruction might accomplish more than cosmic justice. It might unravel the foundational magic that held mortal existence together. Or it might finally free that existence to grow beyond divine manipulation. Fenris and Skoll pressed against the edges of her expanded consciousness, their enhanced forms somehow able to maintain contact despite her transformation. Through the bond that transcended physics, she felt their absolute trust in whatever choice she made. They had followed her into isolation, through revelation, and now into apotheosis. They would follow her into whatever came next. The gods made one final coordinated assault, not against her bindings, but against that trust itself. They struck at the wolves with power meant to sever the bonds of loyalty that had sustained her through 10 years of solitude. If they could turn her companions against her, make her face this ultimate moment alone. But they had misunderstood the nature of what connected her to Fenris and Skoll. It was not divine magic that could be disrupted or mortal emotion that could be manipulated. It was simple recognition between beings who had chosen to share their existence completely. Astrid's crystalline form blazed with new intensity as that recognition became her weapon. "You want to know what you never understood?" she asked, her voice carrying across realities as the final convergence began. "Love isn't a weakness to exploit. It's a strength that makes gods obsolete." She reached into the core of each divine manifestation and began the last phase, not destruction, but transformation. If the gods insisted on returning to physical reality, she would give them exactly what they claimed to want. They would become mortal, bound by the same limitations and possibilities as every other conscious being. They would learn what it meant to grow, to choose, to face consequences without the safety net of eternal nature. Above the fjord, 9 gods screamed as they felt mortality take root in their essence like a cancer made of hope and change, and beautiful, terrible time. The gods' transformation into mortality was not the gentle descent Astrid had envisioned, but a violent implosion that threatened to tear reality apart at its seams. She felt each divine essence collapse inward as eternal nature gave way to finite existence, and the feedback nearly shattered what remained of her crystalline consciousness. Odin's omniscience compressed into mere intuition, his cosmic awareness fragmenting into the limited perception of mortal senses. Thor's command over thunder became simple strength, extraordinary by human standards, but no longer capable of reshaping weather patterns with a gesture. But the cost of forcing such fundamental change was consuming her faster than anticipated. Structural integrity. At 15%, Elena's voice seemed to come from across vast distances, though she stood only meters away. The convergence is destabilizing your matrix. Astrid could feel it. The crystalline form that had replaced her flesh was developing fractures that ran deeper than the physical. Each god's transformation required her to channel forces that exceeded her capacity to contain them safely. She was quite literally burning herself away to fuel their metamorphosis, trading her existence for their limitation. Through fragmenting awareness, she felt Fenris and Skoll pressing closer, their enhanced forms radiating desperate concern. The bond between them carried images, emotions, half-formed thoughts that cut through the cosmic chaos like whispers of home. 10 years of shared solitude. Morning hunts through pristine snow. Evenings by the fire while storms raged outside their sanctuary. All of it about to end. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She had been so focused on stopping the gods that she hadn't truly processed what victory would cost. Not just her life, but the simple, profound companionship that had sustained her through a decade of isolation. The wolves would survive, but they would face the future without her, just as she had once faced the world without her village. "There has to be another way," she whispered, feeling her resolve waver for the first time since the convergence began. "There has to be." But even as the words formed, she knew better. The gods' transformation was only half complete, their divine essence still fighting the imposed mortality with everything they possessed. If she released the binding now, they would snap back to their eternal nature, wounded but not defeated, and far more dangerous for having learned the extent of her capabilities. Above her, Odin's newly mortal form struggled against constraints that were literally rewriting his fundamental nature. You understand now, don't you?" His voice carried pain that no god should have been capable of feeling. "Victory requires sacrifice. We learned that truth eons ago. Everything meaningful demands a price." He was right, and the knowledge tasted like ashes in her dissolving mouth. She had spent 10 years raging against the gods' manipulation, their willingness to treat mortal lives as acceptable losses in their cosmic games. Now she found herself making the same calculation, her existence weighed against the freedom of every future generation. Freya's transformation reached completion with a scream that shattered the remaining ice on the fjord's surface. Where a goddess of beauty and war had floated moments before, a mortal woman now fell toward the stone, her features still striking but no longer capable of inspiring madness or devotion with a glance. She struck the ground hard, gasping as she experienced physical pain for the first time in millennia. 3 gods down, 6 remaining. Astrid's crystalline form developed new fractures with each completed transformation, silver fire bleeding from the cracks like luminous blood. She could feel her consciousness beginning to fade at the edges, individual thoughts becoming harder to maintain as the convergence's final phase approached. Elena was shouting something about cascade failure and energy redistribution, but the words seemed to come from another reality entirely. Only the wolves' presence remained clear, their loyalty blazing through the chaos like twin stars in an empty sky. She reached out through the bond one final time, trying to convey everything she couldn't say aloud. Gratitude for their companionship, pride in what they had become, hope for whatever life awaited them beyond this moment. The wolves pressed against her failing form, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to understand both her choice and its necessity. They were saying goodbye. Thor completed his transformation with less struggle than the others, his fundamental nature perhaps more compatible with physical limitation than omniscience or otherworldly beauty. He rose unsteadily, looking at hands that still carried enormous strength but no longer commanded the forces of storm and lightning. "It's done then," he said quietly. "You've made us what you wanted, mortal, finite, capable of growth and change and death." "Yes," Astrid managed, feeling her voice echo strangely through a throat that was more light than substance. "But the binding won't hold without—" She didn't need to finish. They all understood. The transformation required an anchor to physical reality, and she was that anchor. When her crystalline form finally collapsed, the gods would be truly mortal, but she would be gone. Victory, she realized, felt nothing like she had imagined. The collapse came not as an explosion, but as a gentle dissolution that spread outward from her crystalline core like morning mist. Astrid felt each fragment of her transformed essence scatter into the Arctic air, carrying with it the final threads of the binding that held the gods in their mortal forms. The pain she had expected never materialized. Instead, there was only a profound sense of release, as if she were finally setting down a burden she had carried far too long. Through vision that fractured like breaking glass, she watched the newly mortal gods struggle to comprehend their transformed state. Odin knelt on the stone, pressing his hands to his temples as he grappled with perception limited to a single pair of eyes. The loss of his ravens, of his ability to see across all 9 realms simultaneously, left him fumbling like a man suddenly blinded. Freya sat heavily against a boulder, her chest rising and falling with the novel sensation of requiring breath. Her fingers traced her own face repeatedly, testing features that remained beautiful but no longer carried the power to reshape reality through desire alone. When a drop of moisture fell from her eyes, tears, the first she had shed since achieving godhood, she stared at it in wonder. Thor stood apart from the others, flexing hands that still possessed tremendous strength but felt impossibly empty without Mjolnir's weight. The hammer lay abandoned several meters away, its divine radiance extinguished, reduced to ornate but powerless metal. He made no move to retrieve it. "The binding is stable," Elena called out, her instruments somehow still functioning despite the electromagnetic chaos. "Their transformation is holding even as the convergence collapses." Astrid tried to respond, but found her voice fragmenting along with the rest of her crystalline form. Instead, she reached out through the bond that still connected her to Fenris and Skoll, flooding their consciousness with everything she needed them to understand. They would need to adapt to a world without her guidance, but they possessed the intelligence and strength to thrive. More importantly, they understood something the gods had never learned, that survival meant accepting change rather than fighting it. The wolves pressed closer, their massive forms radiating warmth against her dissolving essence. Through their eyes she caught glimpses of the other gods completing their transformations, Balder discovering that his radiance had become simple warmth, Loki finding his shapeshifting reduced to the mundane flexibility of mortal muscle and bone. Each faced the strange new reality of limitation, of existence bounded by physical laws rather than divine will. Some would adapt. Others would struggle against their imposed mortality until time taught them acceptance. But all would face the consequences of their choices in ways they never had before, and perhaps that would be enough. "You achieved something unprecedented," came a voice nearby. Odin, she realized, speaking with vocal cords rather than direct projection into her mind. His tone carried a note of genuine respect that surprised her. "In 8 centuries of planning, we never conceived that a mortal might transform us rather than simply serve our purposes." Astrid managed a fractured laugh, the sound like wind chimes breaking in a gentle breeze. "Because you never understood what mortals actually are. Not broken gods, waiting to be fixed. We're something entirely different." The crystalline structure that had replaced her body continued its inevitable dissolution, but the process felt less like dying than like returning home after a long journey. The power that had transformed her was flowing back into the earth itself, seeping into the ancient runestones and the foundations of the fjord. Her bloodline's accumulated strength would remain here, dormant but not destroyed, waiting for whatever future might require its awakening. Elena approached with careful steps, her scientific instruments forgotten as she knelt beside Astrid's fading form. The energy readings are stabilizing, the convergence is complete, but— She paused, struggling with words. Is there anything we can do? Any way to preserve? No, Astrid whispered, feeling her consciousness scatter across the wind. This was always the only way. The binding required sacrifice. But look at them. She gestured weakly toward the gods, who were beginning to explore their new limitations with a mixture of horror and fascination. They're learning. For the first time, they're actually learning. Fenris and Skoll pressed against her dissolving essence one final time, their warmth serving as anchor points for her fragmenting awareness. Through their senses, she felt the ancient magic of the bloodline settling into new patterns, no longer focused on supporting divine manifestation, but instead weaving itself into the natural rhythms of the world. The gods would remain mortal. The wolves would adapt and flourish. And somewhere in the intersection of love and sacrifice, purpose had finally found its resolution. As her crystalline form completed its dissolution, Astrid's last coherent thought was not of victory or loss, but of a simple truth that had taken 10 years of isolation to understand. Some chains could only be broken by those willing to forge them first. The Arctic wind carried her essence across the fjord, and the binding held. The silence that followed Astrid's dissolution stretched across the fjord like a held breath, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against stone and the soft whimpering of two wolves who had just lost their world. Elena remained kneeling where Astrid's crystalline form had faded, her instruments registering only background radiation and the steady pulse of transformed divine energy. Around her, 9 figures who had once commanded the cosmos struggled with the alien sensation of finite existence, but her attention stayed fixed on the empty space where her friend had made the ultimate choice. "She's not gone," Elena whispered, studying readings that defied conventional physics. "Not entirely. The energy signature is dispersed but coherent, integrated into the fjord's natural matrix." She looked up at Fenris and Skoll, who watched her with eyes that held new depths of understanding. "She's become part of this place." The wolves tilted their heads in unison, processing words they had never needed to comprehend before. Their enhanced intelligence, Astrid's final gift, allowed them to grasp concepts that would have been impossible just hours earlier: loss, transformation, continuity beyond physical form. Fenris approached Elena slowly, massive paws silent on the stone. When he pressed his muzzle against her hand, she felt something pass between them, not telepathy, but simple recognition. They were both mourning the same person. They were both changed by the same sacrifice. 10 years, Elena said softly, scratching behind the wolf's ears. She spent 10 years preparing for this without even knowing it, learning to choose love over fear, connection over isolation. She glanced toward the gods, who were beginning to help each other stand on unsteady legs, teaching all of us what strength actually means. Across the clearing, Odin took his first mortal steps in millennia, each movement requiring conscious thought and balance. The absence of his ravens felt like phantom pain, a constant reminder of senses now forever beyond reach. When he stumbled slightly, Thor moved to steady him, an act of simple kindness that would have been impossible when pride and power defined their every interaction. "How do you bear it?" Freya asked no one in particular, pressing her palm against her chest, where a heart now beat with urgent rhythm. This constant awareness of limitation, of time passing moment by moment. "You learn," came a voice from the fjord's edge. They turned to see Magnus approaching, his weathered face creased with exhaustion but no longer carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility. Behind him came other survivors of the village, people who had spent 10 years believing themselves alone in the world. Elena stared at their approach, understanding flooding through her. The plague. It wasn't a plague at all. "Protective hibernation," Magnus confirmed, settling heavily on a boulder. When the bloodline awakened, those with even distant traces of the ancient power fell into a sleep that mimicked death. "We've been waiting, dreaming of snow and starlight, until the binding was complete." The reunion was quieter than Elena had expected. No tears, no dramatic embraces, just the profound relief of people discovering they were no longer alone. They gathered around the space where Astrid had made her choice, forming a circle that included gods and mortals, wolves and humans, all of them changed by what they had witnessed. Skoll moved to Elena's other side, his presence solid and comforting. Through the bond Astrid had shared with them, she could sense the wolves' grief, but also their acceptance. They had understood their partner's choice even as she made it, had supported her through their connection, even as it cost them everything. "She saved us all," Elena said, looking around the circle, "not just from Ragnarok, but from the idea that some beings are more important than others. That power justifies manipulation." She met Odin's newly mortal gaze. "You'll have to learn to live without that justification now." The former All-Father nodded slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward where Gungnir had once rested. Finding nothing, he lowered his arm and straightened his shoulders. Perhaps that learning is long overdue. As the Arctic sun traced its low arc across the sky, the survivors began to plan. The village could be rebuilt. The wolves would need care and understanding as they adapted to their enhanced nature. The gods would require guidance as they navigated mortality for the first time. But most importantly, Astrid's choice had created something unprecedented, a world where divine and mortal could coexist without hierarchy, where power served connection rather than domination. Elena felt Fenris lean against her leg and look down to meet intelligent amber eyes. In their depths, she saw not just animal awareness, but genuine understanding. The wolves would be her responsibility now, her connection to the woman who had chosen love over fear when the cosmos hung in the balance. "She's still here," Elena murmured, feeling the truth of it in the wind that carried scents of pine and snow. "In every choice we make differently, because of what she taught us." The binding held, and the changed world began, the new beginning. 6 months after the convergence, Elena stood at the edge of the rebuilt village, watching Fenris and Skoll lead a hunting party through the snow-covered pine forest. The wolves had grown into their roles as both guardians and teachers, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to bridge the gap between human and wild in ways that would have seemed impossible before Astrid's transformation. The village itself bore little resemblance to its previous incarnation. Where once isolated cabins had dotted the fjord's shoreline, now a carefully planned community stretched inland, its buildings designed to accommodate both the returning human survivors and the 9 former gods who were still learning what mortality meant. Elena paused at the memorial they had erected where Astrid had made her choice. Not a statue or traditional marker, but a circle of the original runestones, their surfaces now carrying a subtle inner light that pulsed in rhythm with the aurora overhead. Visitors often reported hearing whispers on the wind when they stood within the circle, words of encouragement or guidance that seemed tailored to their specific struggles. "She would be proud," Magnus said, approaching with the careful steps of a man still adjusting to a body that had aged a decade in hibernation. His role as village elder had evolved into something closer to therapist, helping both humans and gods navigate their transformed reality. "Look at what her choice has created." Elena followed his gaze toward the community center, where Thor was teaching a group of children basic woodworking, while Freya helped their parents plan the spring planting. The former god of thunder moved with deliberate patience, his massive hands gentle as he guided small fingers in shaping wood. The goddess who had once commanded love and war now spent her days learning about crop rotation and soil management, finding purpose in nurturing growth rather than manipulating desire. "The hardest adjustment has been Odin," Magnus continued quietly. "A lifetime of omniscience doesn't prepare you for making decisions with incomplete information." Elena nodded, remembering the former All-Father's struggle with simple choices: what to eat for breakfast, which path to take through the village, how to spend hours that no longer stretched into eternity. He had taken to long walks with Skoll, the wolf's enhanced intelligence providing a unique perspective on adaptation and change. Something about their conversations seemed to bring Odin peace, though he rarely spoke of what they discussed. The sound of laughter drew Elena's attention to the fjord's edge, where a group of children played in the snow while Loki demonstrated his remaining shape-shifting abilities. now limited to minor alterations in posture and expression, but still entertaining enough to delight his young audience. His transformation had perhaps been the most complete, his chaotic nature finding new outlets in storytelling and play, rather than cosmic manipulation. They're becoming who they always could have been, Elena mused, pulling her coat tighter against the Arctic wind. Without the burden of divine responsibility, they're discovering aspects of themselves that were buried under eons of accumulated power. A familiar presence brushed against her consciousness, not Astrid's voice exactly, but something that carried the same warmth and understanding. The sensation came strongest when Elena stood within the runestone circle, or when she watched the wolves interact with the community they now helped protect. It felt like approval, like love extending beyond the boundaries of physical existence. Fenris emerged from the tree line with the hunting party, carrying news of increased wildlife populations and expanding territory. The wolves' reports had become crucial to the village's sustainability, their enhanced senses providing early warning of weather changes and resource fluctuations. More importantly, their presence served as a living reminder of Astrid's sacrifice and the bonds that transcended species boundaries. As evening approached, the community gathered for their weekly shared meal, a tradition that had emerged naturally as both humans and gods learned to navigate their new relationships. Elena watched Balder help serve food with hands that still radiated gentle warmth, his diminished but persistent light providing comfort to anyone struggling with their own adaptations. The conversations during these meals had evolved from tentative exchanges to genuine discussions about philosophy, purpose, and the nature of growth. The gods brought perspectives shaped by millennia of experience, while the humans offered insights into resilience and the beauty found in temporary existence. Together, they were creating something unprecedented, a culture that valued both wisdom and wonder, permanence and change. Later, as the aurora painted the sky in shades of green and gold, Elena made her way to the memorial circle. Fenris and Skoll joined her there, as they did most evenings, their presence a bridge between past and future. She could feel Astrid's essence woven into the very air around them, not as a ghost, but as a continuing influence that shaped every choice toward connection rather than isolation. "Thank you," Elena whispered to the lights above, knowing that somewhere in the intersection of sacrifice and love, her friend's consciousness persisted, "for showing us that the strongest chains are the ones we choose to forge, and that sometimes the greatest freedom comes from binding ourselves to something larger than our own survival." The wind carried her words across the fjord, and in its echo, Elena heard the sound of a future being born. One choice, one connection, one act of love at a time.